She did not wear armor, she did not carry a weapon, she arrived alone, aboard a rusted diplomatic cruiser, painted with the seal of old Earth, and the blood of older promises. Her name was Mara Ellen, born in the coastal ruins of Tel Mora, educated in the skybound academies rebuilt after the ice collapse, chosen not for her strength, or her name, but because she had no fear in her voice and no lies in her spine. The Galactic Empire had received her transmission with silence, followed by laughter, followed by permission to land. They allowed her to step foot on Halvax Prime, the capital world, a place of glass towers and gravity wells, a planet where no human envoy had survived longer than a speech. She stepped into the plaza at midday, her cloak white, her breath slow beneath 3 suns and 1,000 guns. Crowds gathered above from the tower balconies and hover rails. Cameras hovered, drones buzzed, everything streamed to 10 billion screens across imperial space. Everyone wanted to see the girl, Earth sent alone to negotiate with monsters. She began to speak, not loudly, but clearly, her voice echoing across the plaza. Without amplification, she spoke of ceasefire, of lost children, of burned colonies. She named planets the Empire pretended did not exist. She mentioned the names of the fallen, the forgotten, the silenced. Her eyes never dropped, her hands never shook, and the soldiers did not move. Then one of them did. He stepped forward, silent in black armor, the emblem of the Empress carved across his chest. He raised his rifle, not slowly, not with hesitation, but like it had already been decided before she ever spoke, and he pulled the trigger once, and then again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again, 7 times, each round tearing through her chest, leaving glowing holes in a cloak meant for peace, not war, and she fell backward onto the black stone beneath the towers that scraped the clouds. The crowd gasped, but not for long, because the sound was cut by command. The plaza sealed the footage, archived, filtered, stripped of sound and meaning, rebroadcast with imperial commentary. She had attacked first, she was armed, she was mad, all lies polished into law, while her body remained untouched, lying in the square beneath the alien sun, with no one allowed near, and nothing left to suck on Earth. The silence was immediate, not from fear, not from defeat, but from calculation. The council did not speak, the generals did not blink, the satellites turned away from the stars and toward the ice fields of the north, where something ancient waited, and listened, and warmed itself for the first time in 100 years. The girl they shot was no longer just a name, no longer just a voice. She was the match lit against oxygen-soaked paper, the question the Empire never wanted asked, the echo that would not fade. She was Mara Ellen, and even as she bled, the universe began to shift, not with sound, not with rage, but with the slow rising weight of something older than revenge. There were no press briefings, no retaliation orders, no fleets launched from Earth, no warnings sent across the black. Nothing rose from the surface of the homeworld, except stillness and signal silence. And for the first time in decades, the Galactic Empire paused, not from guilt, not from fear, but from confusion, because Earth had always spoken back, and now it did not. They watched from orbit as the girl's body lay cold and quiet beneath the triune suns, unmoving, unguarded, yet untouched. Her white cloak soaked through with dark blood that shimmered in the ultraviolet light of Halvax Prime, and none dared approach her, not civilians, not soldiers, not even the Empress herself, who watched from her tower with a glass of flame wine in one hand and her other hand resting on the command table. Her advisors nervous, her generals eager, but she only watched and waited. Because she remembered the name the girl had spoken once before, being silenced, and the name had chilled her for reasons she could not explain. Meanwhile, on Earth, in the far forgotten corners of the northern hemisphere, beyond the reach of cities and satellites, beneath the ice, older than civilization itself, something stirred deep in a vault, not listed on maps, not recorded in digital archives, not mentioned in history, something that predated the galactic age, that had been hidden long before the first empire rose and fell and rose again. Inside that vault, behind layers of cryosteel and magnetic seal, a single red light blinked to life, and an old protocol activated, not by hands, not by vote, but by an algorithm older than any nation, a program that required no approval, only a condition met, and that condition had just happened. 7 kinetic pulses striking, 1 diplomatic body registered in real time, relayed across Earth's dormant warning satellites, pinging one forgotten failsafe. They had called it protocol. Thorn, it had no override, no failsafe, no conscience. It simply opened the door, and from the cold darkness stepped a silhouette, a man, perhaps once human, or perhaps only shaped like one tall gaunt wrapped in carbon. armored that shimmered with frost. He stepped forward slowly, not waking but reactivating, and as his feet touched the stone he looked up with eyes that glowed, not red, not blue, not green, but something older than color, something that could not be seen without trembling. He did not speak, he did not question, he did not ask who or why or where, he simply walked, and with every step the vault behind him groaned, the walls splitting, as if afraid of what they once held, and far above the polar clouds, the sky cracked open, as a buried launch system spat fire, and lifted a single ancient transport craft into orbit, piloted by no one, yet guided by something very precise. The monster Earth warned them about had just awakened, and it was already en route back on Halvax Prime. The sun dipped behind the obsidian towers, and shadows lengthened over the square where Mara Ellen still lay silent, but not gone, not forgotten, and not alone anymore. Because something was coming for her, not to avenge her but to complete what she started, and this time, it would not speak first. Time passed slowly across Halvax Prime, and the sun did not move, and the winds refused to blow, and for 7 hours the body of Mara Ellen remained untouched in the Imperial Plaza, where blood dried into the cracks between stones and silence wrapped the city in something heavier than fear. The crowd had been dismissed, and the cameras had stopped rolling, and yet no one dared clean the scene, no one dared retrieve the body, not because they were forbidden, but because something in the air felt wrong, like static, like watching a storm on the edge of the sky, knowing it is coming but not knowing from where. The Empress paced her upper chambers without speaking, her hands behind her back. Her generals waiting for instruction, her aides whispering about ghost systems and unexplained sensor flares deep in the outer rim. They spoke of it like legend, like a myth returning from the grave, but she knew better. She remembered the cold warnings whispered in the archives before the First War began. The warnings Earth had given freely, the ones no one believed, because Earth had always been soft until it was not tanned. Now for 7 hours there was no response, no fleet, no threat. Just silence and stillness, and then something began to change. It began with the blood. The red had turned to silver as the twin suns lowered the glow of her wounds, brightened not with flame but with a strange internal light, soft pulsing threads running from her chest to her fingertips, and then her fingers twitched, once, twice again, and then she sat up. There was no gasp, no scream, no sudden motion, just quiet, controlled movement, as if she had not died but simply paused. Her eyes opened and they did not blink, and her mouth did not open, and she looked, not confused, but certain. She touched the floor with her hand, as if feeling for vibration, as if she was listening to something no one else could hear, and then she rose to her feet and stood still under the heavy alien sky alarms. Should have sounded, but none did. Soldiers should have rushed her, but none moved. Scanners registered her as dead still, and yet she breathed, her vitals hidden behind a screen. Earth had buried into her skin something old, something forbidden by interstellar law, something they had once outlawed in peace treaties, and used anyway when the treaties failed. The Empress watched through a high window, unmoving, her breath shallow, the palace guards frozen in place, as Mara turned and faced the sky and said one word. Kind. It was not a prayer or a call or a command. It was a fact, a signal, a release, and somewhere high above the planet, hidden behind the gas giants, moons, a single ship dropped from slipspace, silent, black, alive, and falling fast toward the city where the girl had been left for dead. She was no longer dead, and now neither was he. The ship came down through the clouds like a black wound in the sky, silent and cold and made of no material the Empire could scan. It moved without fire, without light, without any sound except the crack of air bending around it, and within seconds, it landed, not with fury but with certainty, on the edge of the Imperial Plaza where Mara Ellen stood alone beneath the fading sunlight. The hull of the ship peeled open like petals unfolding from a flower carved in darkness, and from within stepped the thing Earth had sealed away, the thing they called Cain, though he had no name, no history, no record, only the warning Earth had once spoken into the stars. Do not awaken him, do not make him walk again, do not make him remember. He stepped onto the stone, without looking around, without hesitation, his body tall and wrapped in shadow, his skin like obsidian, his eyes not glowing but absorbing every drop of light around him, and where he walked, the air changed. The soldiers stationed nearby dropped their weapons, not because they were afraid but because their hands refused to move, and their minds refused to believe what they were seeing. Mara did not flinch when she saw him. She only stepped forward and placed her hand over her chest where the 7th bullet had entered, and said nothing, and Cain nodded once and walked past her into the plaza, where the blood still marked the place. They left her for dead Empire drones, swarmed in seconds, buzzing from rooftops, scanning his shape, calculating his threat levels, measuring his kinetic potential, and they all reached the same conclusion: destroy on-site fire at once. Eliminate without delay non-fire. Their targeting systems failed, not from interference, but from design, because Earth had woven something into Kane that machines could not explain, something primal, something older than software. And when the drones began to fall from the sky, one by one, with no shot fired, no motion made, the Imperial guards watching from above finally understood that this was not a soldier, not a weapon, not even a machine. He was something else. The Empress watched from her throne room, hands frozen above the override key's lips, parted but unable to speak, as Kane looked upward directly into the security feed, as if he could see her through 10 layers of alloy and glass and neural shielding, and he smiled, not from joy, not from vengeance, but from memory. One of the generals finally gave the order: fire, everything, destroy him, erase the square, burn the girl, and silence the past. And the towers around the plaza lit with pulse cannons, ready to unleash the full fury of the Empire. They never fired the moment Kane raised his hand. Every circuit inside the towers burst, every weapon shut down, every gun turned off, not destroyed, just erased, like the code had been overwritten, like Kane had simply decided they no longer existed. Then he turned to Mara, and without words she walked beside him, and the two moved forward as the crowd parted, not from command, but from instinct, and every soul on Halvex Prime knew the same truth at once. He was not here to negotiate. He was here to end the conversation. Kane moved through the streets of Halvex Prime, as if the city had already surrendered, not in ceremony but in truth, because nothing around him functioned as it should, and no one near him remembered how to fight. The gravity around him, warped ever so slightly, buildings tilted away from him, glass windows cracked without sound, data feeds went blank, not scrambled, not hacked, simply blank, as though the very concept of connection failed in his presence. He did not run, did not shout, did not command. He walked, and each step carried the weight of old design, each motion a line of code written in the language of vengeance. Systems tried to scan him, and failed. Neural drones tried to target him, and shut down in mid-air. Armored guards raised their rifles only to find their fingers refusing to obey, their minds locked between fear and futility. He passed through the Gate of Crowns, where imperial laws were once read aloud and symbols of dominion cast into stone. He reached out and touched one of the engraved panels, and it melted, not from heat, not from force, but from memory, the memory of what it meant to defy Earth, of what Earth built when treaties were broken and peace betrayed. Mara followed behind him, barefoot, her cloak torn, her skin still marked by the 7 wounds that no longer bled. She said nothing. She did not have to. The way she moved, the way she watched, the way the light bent around her, like it knew her pain was enough. The Empire had tried to kill a diplomat, and now they faced something far worse, something that could not be reasoned with or delayed. In the heart of the capital, Kane reached the Tower of Signal, the central node from which imperial law spread to the outer worlds, a spire of black stone and silver, like guarded by sentries who had once trained to fight machines and monsters and revolts, but never this, never something that made their training irrelevant. He looked at the gate, and it opened, not from code or clearance, but because the structure itself remembered him, or something like him, from a time the Empire pretended had never existed. He stepped inside, and the lights went dark, and the cameras turned inward, and the alarms that tried to scream failed to even whisper from orbit. A fleet commander watched from the bridge of the capital, dreadnought eyes wide as every screen aboard his vessel went black, systems blinking offline, one by one, as if falling asleep or being silenced by something too old to understand. And when he tried to issue a command, his voice vanished before reaching the crew, and he realized the silence was no longer just around Kane, but spreading outward like a pulse, like a truth. Kane did not destroy the Empire with weapons. He destroyed its certainty. He shattered the lie that Earth had gone soft, that Earth had forgotten how to end things. And as the signal tower crumbled from within, and the entire grid fell into darkness, Mara finally spoke. For the first time since she stood up from death, she said, "This is only the beginning." She walked behind him, not because she was weak, not because she was lost, but because that was the shape of the storm. He was the front, the first strike, the edge of the blade, and she was the shadow behind it, not softer only, colder, not smaller only, quieter. When she woke from death, she had not felt fear or confusion, only clarity, a clarity sharp as glass and slow as the ocean. It was as if something ancient had filled her lungs and rewired her blood. Her wounds no longer burned, they hummed, each scar a signal, each pulse a whisper, and the silence within her was not emptiness, it was control. She saw what Cain did and she understood it was not chaos. It was correction. He was not a killer. He was a reset. He walked through systems and made them remember what they had tried to forget, and as she followed she saw the cracks grow wider, not in buildings, not in walls, but in belief and faith in the eyes of the soldiers who had laughed when they shot her. They no longer laughed in the Imperial barracks across Halvax Prime. The younger troops whispered her name, but they did not call her Mara anymore. They called her the one who stood the dead woman, the white flame. They told stories already false, and yet still true. They said she had never bled. They said she had never fallen. They said she had risen before the shot and walked into it, to summon the monster that slept beneath the ice of Earth. She never corrected the mass. She moved through the streets, behind Cain. The people parted not just in fear but in awe, because while Cain frightened them, Mara made them feel something they could not name, a sense that justice had shape now, and it walked with bare feet and hollow eyes, and 7 wounds that would never heal because they were not meant to. They were meant to stay open, as proof as memory. She passed a child holding a drone toy too, broken to fly, and she paused and placed her hand on the child's shoulder, and the toy lit and rose and hovered, and the child smiled, and the soldiers watching saw it and said nothing, because they knew then that she was not Cain's follower. She was not behind him because she belonged behind him. She was there because she chose to be, and Cain did not walk alone inside the Tower of Signal. The data streams she had once studied now unraveled like paper in fire, and she knew the Empire would not recover because recovery requires faith, and she could see in the eyes of the Empire that their faith had cracked, not in politics, not in control, but in story, because the story they told about Earth had been shattered the day she stood up with light pouring from her wounds and called down the one thing they thought could never return. And as Cain reached the center of the tower and placed his hand upon the core, she stepped beside him, not behind, not after, but beside, and together they watched as the last light of the Imperial grid faded, and for the first time since the Empire was born, the galaxy felt small again. She had not left the throne room in 13 years, not since the last uprising was crushed, not since the firestorms raged over the salt moons, and the twin admirals broke their oaths and disappeared into the black knot, since she signed the final treaty with Earth and smiled, knowing the words would never be honored. Now, she stood barefoot in the stone corridor outside the chamber where her voice had once ruled across 600 systems, and the air around her tasted different, as if even the palace itself no longer belonged to her. She walked without guards, without armor, without weapons, her long crimson gown dragging behind her, stained with dust and sweat and silence, and as she moved through the gilded halls the staff turned away, not out of fear but out of shame, for they had seen the broadcasts, they had watched the plaza feed go dark. They had seen the girl rise and the black ship land, and they had heard the name whispered through the air ducts. Can she pass the wall of faces, a hallway carved with the visages of every sovereign who came before her, their eyes cold and still, their mouths locked in eternal decree, and for the first time she could feel them, watching not as ancestors, not as ghosts, but as witnesses, powerless like the rest. Outside the sky had turned a strange shade of violet, and the clouds moved against the wind, and the sun refused to set, as if the world itself had paused, unsure of how to end the day, because endings were no longer written by the Empire. Endings now came with bare feet and old names and forgotten codes. She walked to the edge of the central bridge that overlooked the plaza, and saw the 2 figures standing in the ruins of the Tower of Signal. Cain, unmoving like a monument, Mara beside him, her hands folded, her eyes closed, and around them the people of the capital knelt, not from command, not from tradition, but from something older than law, something they did not understand but could not deny. The Empress remembered the first time she met a diplomat from Earth, how gentle they were, how careful, how quiet, as if their power was held behind glass, and for years she believed the Empire had cracked that glass and drained it dry, but now she saw that Earth had never revealed what lay beneath. They had never needed to, until now. She could not stop shaking. She had built fleets larger than nations, signed death warrants with her thumb, dismantled entire cultures with a whisper, and now she could not lift her hand to call the guard. She could not move her lips to order a strike. She could not even remember the name of her last conquest, because this was not a rebellion, it was not a war. This was something worse. This was history waking up and remembering what was done. She lowered her eyes to the stone floor, and the silence behind her grew louder, as the throne she once ruled from cracked along its spine. Without sound, without force, without touch, the Empire was ending, and she knew it, because for the first time in her reign she had no idea what to say. The plaza had gone still, even the wind had stopped, even the sky had softened its color, as if the world was leaning in to listen because Cain, the one who had walked in silence, the one who had moved like a shadow across history, finally opened his mouth, and when he did, the sound that came was not a roar, not a whisper, not even a voice, as much as it was a weight, a force, a feeling that wrapped around every soul within reach and settled into the bones. Like an oath, he spoke one word, and the word was, remember. It was not a command, not a threat, not a plea. It was a sentence that stretched across time, a signal that reached the satellites, still clinging to life above the city, a message that spread through every broken screen and every cracked communicator and every darkened console, and the Empire heard it across every colony, every fortress, every ship drifting in the dark void between stars. Remember. And with that word came images, not illusions, not holograms, but memories fed into the minds of those who had never seen them. Battles the Empire denied, wars that had been erased, cities that had burned under the boots of peacekeepers, children taken, families broken, treaties burned. While diplomats smiled, they saw Earth not as the weak planet they had mocked, but as the scarred mother of war, as the quiet keeper of monsters, as the forge that built Cain, not in labs but in loss and rage and necessity. And then Cain spoke again, and this time he said the names of the forgotten, the names of those whose lives were counted as background noise, the ones who had vanished when planets were claimed, and settlements were erased, and whole languages turned to dust beneath the heel of Empire. The words had no rhythm and no beauty. They were not poetry, they were fact, and fact alone, and the people heard them, and could not close their ears, and could not look away. And they knew in that moment that the story had changed and would never again be theirs to write alone. The Empress watched from the high balcony, eyes wide, fingers pressed against the stone rail, her breath caught between rage and terror, and something worse, the knowledge that nothing she could say would matter now, because Cain was not there to argue, not there to demand. He was there to deliver. And Mara stood beside him, her face unreadable, her hands at her sides, glowing faintly from the wounds that never healed. And when Cain finished speaking, she stepped forward and raised one hand, and the city's last broadcast tower sparked to life without signal, without tech, as if summoned by will alone. She spoke not to threaten but to declare, and what she said was simple. This is not vengeance, this is correction, this is not conquest, this is conclusion. And as her voice spread across the stars, bouncing between systems, drifting into the ears of sleeping soldiers and silent pilots, the last message of Earth began to take shape. The Empire had not been defeated by war, it had been undone by truth. The silence that followed was not empty, it was not quiet, it was not peace, it was something else. It was a stillness filled with recognition, with reckoning, with the sound of truths settling into place, like stones finally finding the bottom of a deep black sea. And above them all stood Cain and Mara, not as rulers, not as conquerors, not even as victors, but as something far older, as reminders. The palace lights dimmed across Halvax Prime, not because power had failed, but because the systems had chosen to rest, as if the world itself had decided to take a breath for the first time in an age. And the people did not shout, did not run, did not panic. They simply stood in the plazas and the streets and the towers and stared at the sky, as if waiting for the stars to change. Cain said nothing more. He had spoken, and the echo of that speech now lived in every corner of the Empire, not as command, but as gravity, a pull, a shift, a change in how things would now be. And as he turned and walked from the center of the city, the stone beneath his feet smoothed and cooled, and the banners that once bore the imperial crest unraveled on their own, drifting down like leaves from a dying tree. Mara followed, but not behind him. This time she walked beside him, the way two halves of one truth might walk forward without destination, only direction. And in her presence children stepped forward, holding their hands out to touch hers, and adults lowered their heads, not in shame, but in something that had no name yet, something like reverence. But older, in the far reaches of the galaxy, aboard a carrier ship still floating between stars, a young ensign received the last message from Halvax Prime, and played it once, then again, and when the commanding officer asked for orders, the ensign simply replied, "We do not fight ghosts." And the officer nodded and turned the ship toward the edge of known space without another word. On a moon where prisoners of political defiance had been locked away without trial for decades, the guards unlocked the gates, not because they were ordered to, but because the locks had dissolved overnight, as if rewritten, and the prisoners walked free into dawn. And one of them looked up and said, "I told you, Earth never forgets." And in the throne room of the Imperial Palace, The Empress sat alone, no longer on the throne, now cracked and split but on the cold floor beneath it, and in her hands she held a simple device, a message recorder once used to address the stars, and she spoke into it not as a ruler but as a witness, and said, "We were wrong, and now we remember." And then she dropped the recorder and let it break back on Earth deep in the vaults where Cain was made. The lights flickered once, then stilled, and the old machines powered down for the last time, and the door that once held him was sealed again, not in fear but in respect, and above that door new words were carved, not in warning but in truth: "Do not awaken unless the silence has been broken."